nobody is willing to individually pay the price of their pseudo convictions when it comes to climate change. And the fact that people worship this child, Greta Thunberg, I guess she's like 18 now, right? But it's basically still a kid, doesn't know anything, and think that that they treat her as some kind of symbol of wisdom on this. The same people who say, shut up and listen to Fauci and all the doctors because they're experts, the same people tell you, shut up and listen to Greta Thunberg. She understands the climate. Greta Thunberg couldn't do my Algebra 1 homework from high school. But I'm going to listen to her about the global economy and how we're all going to die unless we listen to her. Like this, there is a mass hysteria that has spread on issues like this, and particularly on climate change. I've talked to people I've had people approach me and say, you seem pretty reasonable and everything else. Some wealthy people in New York, this has happened before. They say, but I mean, you don't believe in climate change? They look at me like I'm crazy. And they think that that's some kind of marker of intelligence. Oh, believing in climate change means you're a smart person? Based on what? We have hit it. The debt ceiling. We are there, my friends. $31.4 trillion. That is the statutory limit. The United States government has hit the statutory limit like the Titanic running into an iceberg. Just kidding. It's all going to be fine, everybody. They're going to try to freak you out about this. Look, the debt isn't all going to be fine insofar as this is a big problem. But oh my gosh, the government's not going to pay its bills. It's going to pay its bills. I mean, here's how CNN describes it. Forcing the Treasury Department to take extraordinary measures to keep the government paying its bills, escalating pressure on Capitol Hill to avoid a catastrophic default. The battle lines for the high-stakes fight have already been set. Hardline Republicans, sounds scary, Clay, who have enormous sway in the House because of the party's slim majority, have demanded that lifting the borrowing cap be tied to spending reductions. Doesn't that seem, I mean, let's put on our reasonable guy and gal hats for a moment. We have run up a $31 trillion debt. If somebody wants to claim that it doesn't matter, cue Paul Krugman with some column where he's like, it doesn't matter. We're borrowing money from ourselves. It doesn't matter. Paul Krugman, perhaps the most consistently wrong Nobel laureate I can think of in history. I mean, the guy's wrong about everything all the time. If Paul Krugman says buy, you should sell. That's the way it works. Here we are, 31 trillion. If it's no big deal, why not 50 trillion?
Or 100 trillion, 200 trillion. Why not just give everybody $10 million if there is no connection whatsoever to monetary policy and economic health?
They're really just hoping that people can't fathom or will ignore what this really means and what the financial implications of this may be for them. Just the service on the debt that we have begins to crowd out spending. And the problem is that when Democrats see that, their reaction will be, oh, but we have more essential things we have to spend money on, Clay. The history of fiat currency, you want to get scared, you can read about the history of fiat currency and what ends up happening to governments that abuse it, because eventually it collapses. Now, I'm not saying our currency is going to collapse. We're very fortunate. This is America. Joe Biden's in charge. It feels like our economy is almost idiot-proof. It's not quite, but almost. And yet $31 trillion should be alarm bells, shouldn't it?
It's not only that it's $31 trillion to me, because, Buck, if we had added that $31 trillion along the way of our 200-plus years as a nation, such that every year had basically been the same cost, we're not. We are accelerating our spending in an aggressive way. And this is important because the Tea Party initially got its voice when we approached $10 trillion national debt. That was a big number. That was a flashpoint. Many people said, oh my goodness, this is a monstrous debt that we have built up. 10 trillion. As you just said, we're now over 30 trillion. So in the space of 12 years, we've added $20 trillion to our national debt. And we are running up, it appears, around $1 trillion a year in additional national debt every year into the foreseeable future. When does it end? How does it end? One way to contextualize this is by just talking about the percentage of our overall expenses that are now eaten up by interest. Because the interest on $30 trillion is approaching a substantial scale of our national debt. And I was reading the other day, I think in the Wall Street Journal, Buck, only about 16% of our budget now is discretionary. Think about that for a minute. We have so many obligations when it comes to Social Security, when it comes to Medicare, when it comes to Medicaid, that even if you went in with a scalpel and you said, okay, we're going to slice and dice this expenditures, only 16% of our budget is discretionary. So when we're talking about multi-trillion-dollar budgets and all those things, understand that most of that money is already spent. And so if you were, many states have a balanced budget amendment, right? So if you live in where I do in the state of Tennessee, we can't spend more money as a state than we take in. The federal government has not had that restriction. I use the example, we spent more money responding to COVID than we did World War II, even in real dollars, which is crazy to think about. So how do we fix this? This is an untenable position for us to be in. And ultimately, it is, you can't just cover your eyes and claim, like I thought when I was a kid, Buck. I bet you kind of thought about this too. I used to not worry about the national debt in the 1980s because I'd just be like, well, the government can just print more money and they can always pay off their national debt. That's kind of the magical thinking that Democrats are governing with right now. And unfortunately, there aren't enough Republican adults in the room who are going to sit down and say this is an untenable position. At some point, we have to restrain the spending. But in terms of this story, we know how it ends. I don't get very fired up with stories that I know how they end already. We're not going to default. The country's not going to go bankrupt. Like, eventually, there's going to be a resolution on what the spending looks like.
The national debt in the year 2000 was $5.7 trillion.
I mean, that's amazing to think about. Say that again. 2000.
To the year 2000, so just over 20 years ago, it was 5.6 and change trillion dollars.
So we have added $25 trillion plus in national debt in the 21st century alone.
When the Tea Party recognized what was going on in 2008, 2009, when the national debt was $11 trillion in 2009, it then jumped up by 2016. It was almost $20 trillion. And now here we are. It is $31.4 trillion. It has taken off like the climate change hockey stick graph chart that people used to talk. They don't talk about that anymore because, the data. But here although Al Gore, we need to get some of, just for entertainment purposes, for everyone's amusement, we need to find some of the thunderous, bloated Al Gore, pounding the table about the need, the urgency to save the planet. And the guy is such a lunatic. And I feel sorry for people that believed in his nonsense.
I think
we've
got it. We've got it already in the roster here, so we can play it.
I think we can toss that in the mix because, on the one hand, there's people who are saying, hey, we're $31 trillion in debt. Isn't there an urgency to tackle this problem? Don't we want to make sure we don't create a situation where we have, hyperinflation at some point in our future, or we have a default on the debt, or any of these things that can happen that everyone right now says, oh, that'll never happen. Meanwhile, back in Al Gore land over in Davos, he put down his third cheeseburger long enough to start pounding the table and yelling at everybody. I'm actually kind of hungry right now. Yelling at everybody about this. Play the clip, would you?
That's the part of the atmosphere that has oxygen, the troposphere, and it's only 5 to 7 kilometers thick. That's what we're using as an open sewer. If you could drive a car straight up in the air at interstate highway speeds, you'd get to the top of that blue line in 5 minutes. and all the greenhouse gas pollution would be below you. We're still putting 162 million tons into it every single day, and the accumulated amount is now trapping as much extra heat as would be released by 600,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding every single day on the Earth. That's what's boiling the oceans, creating these atmospheric rivers and the rain bombs, and sucking the moisture out of the land and creating the droughts and melting the ice and raising the sea level and causing these waves of climate refugees predicted to reach 1 billion in this century. Look at the xenophobia and political authoritarian trends that have come from just a few million refugees. What about 1 billion? We would lose our capacity for self-governance on this world. We have to act. So in answer to your question, I would say we have to have a sense of urgency much greater than we have yet had, and we need to make some changes. We've heard about divides at this conference between the North and South and the East and West. There's another divide, increasingly, between those who are old enough to be in positions of power and the young people of this world. Greta Thunberg was just arrested in Germany. I agree with her efforts to stop that coal mine in Germany.
I mean, he's like a psychopathic cult leader screaming nonsense at people, and yet he's surrounded with some of the richest and most influential global elites in the world. I mean, they're boiling the seas. He should go jump in the water off Long Island in the wintertime right now. Go check it out.
Why doesn't Greta ever protest in China? She protests in an awful lot of places where she knows the consequences of protest are actually just praise. Right? I just, people who constantly protest and never are willing to protest the places that are doing the worst version of what they're protesting, I don't have any respect for them. Like if Greta got on an airplane and flew to China and went and found the most polluting region in China and locked herself to a gate at a Chinese factory, I'll be like, okay, like she's living her worldview. She's actually putting herself on the line. When you're in Europe or you're in the United States or you're in a democracy and you decide to protest, you often get rewarded. This is like the Kaepernick thing. When taking a knee makes you more money than standing for the national anthem, is it really brave to take a knee? No. I mean, go to China, actually stand up to places where there are real human rights violations. Put yourself on the line. I mean, she can fly in there right now. If she's truly obsessed with climate change, China is creating far more global greenhouse emissions than any other country, I think, in the world. They have relatively limited, if any, interest in actually declining that. Go chain yourself to the entrance gate of a Chinese factory and see what they do to you.
But isn't it remarkable that it is so much more fashionable as we are sitting here and the $31 trillion debt limit has been hit. And by any objective historical standard, it's crazy what the federal government is doing. It's crazy. The problem with waiting until it's obvious to everybody is then it's too late. That's also when you will learn the history of fiat currencies and spending crazes. By the time everybody gets that this is an issue, it's already too far gone.
Well, and this is the basis for crypto, right, Buck? This is what all the crypto people, if you really, the ones who are smart enough to understand it, are like, you can't trust currencies anymore because they're so devalued based on the debt loads that the only thing that's going to have any value is a universal cryptocurrency. Now, it clearly has not been the case recently, but that's their argument. They see it, at least.
It's still an argument. I'm not sure how convincing it is because, unfortunately, crypto is also subject, meaning, sure, Bitcoin is limited because of the blockchain technology that allows you to know how, first of all, there's a limited number of coins, and then everyone can know through blockchain what all the transactions are based on the ledger, right? So that's all public. But if crypto is going to be people creating new coins all the time, there's a problem with just, oh, look, there's a new crypto coin out there.
My biggest thing with crypto is if you really think we're headed towards governmental collapse, or you really think the Wi-Fi is going to be that reliable? Like, I think we'll go back to gold bars and, like the actual ways that we had physical assets, right?
You'll notice that in post-apocalyptic movies, there's never a guy who's like, hey, I need food, oil, and ammunition. Here's my thumb drive with my Dogecoin. Like, that doesn't really get it done.
I'm not sold on the idea that nerds are going to deliver the world, and suddenly the Wi-Fi doesn't work that regularly in my house now, and the democracy works. I'm not very convinced that if the world collapses, then I'm going to be able to get on and look at cat videos.
Wow. Clay, I you don't have to give me an in-depth analysis on this. I just know gut reaction. Would you rather Biden continue as president for the rest of his term, or do you think Al Gore replacing him would be better or worse?
Oh, I think Al Gore would be way better. I think it would be way better just because I think that Gore is actually capable of thought. And I don't like. I understand this whole obsession with climate change is
this is lunacy, Clay. Okay, this is like his religion, and he's a high priest in it, and it's. I think, dude, they would get rid of plastic bags in Tennessee. They'd come after you guys.
I don't think that he would be able to do anything that they haven't already done on climate-related issues, and I think he's lost his mind. I think this is the downside in general, Buck. I would say with being a public figure for a long time and not having some dose of reality. It's just like, does he care about like who wins a college football game? I think it's important to not get maniacally focused on any one thing, right? And his thing is the climate, like Greta.
Here he is yesterday saying that the greatest threat to remember, 31.4 trillion, we just hit it today here. The greatest threat to the global economy, not the Russia-Ukraine war, not the 31 trillion. No, none of that. It is, of course, climate change. Play clip 8.
We live on an Earth that is under siege, and it's costing an increasing amount each year. In the last decade, $2.5 trillion, an increase of $1 trillion over the previous 10 years. In the annual report put out by the WEF here in Davos each year, the greatest threat to the global economy is the climate crisis.
I just don't buy it. Look, Buck, here's my thing, and nobody ever really is able to understand this, or I understand is the wrong word, but like really like dispute it. If you study the history of the Earth's geology for a very long time, what you see is that wide ranges of temperature occur all of the time, right? Like there are dinosaur bones in far northern Canada because it used to be, and I'm not an expert on the overall climate, but it used to be like a swamp and tropical environment in Canada, right? Historically, and I'm not talking historically, maybe even the wrong word because we're talking about maybe geologically, the constant change of temperature has been one of the biggest parts of life on the planet. So I just don't buy that suddenly humans are going to get wiped off the planet because the climate changes. So
I think that you can make this really simple because Al Gore, we could just play you endless clips of him saying completely insane things on a regular basis, making predictions that are absolutely wrong, and it doesn't matter. He doesn't care. And so in a sense, what we've seen with COVID, where people have been completely wrong, took all this power into their hands, totally wrong, and there's no remorse, there's no apology. They just kind of continue going on with this. Climate is the area where you've seen something similar to that. The science says, but the science is always wrong. So why do we keep listening to the quote science? I'm here in Miami right now, Clay. If I went up to somebody, because if you look at An Inconvenient Truth, the Al Gore movie, you remember Florida goes underwater very, very soon.
I've never even watched An Inconvenient Truth. I should probably go watch it.
It's so bad. It's so bad. I had a college girlfriend when I was back in college. She was liberal, and she made me watch it, and it's terrible. But anyway, if I went up to somebody who had beachfront property here down in Florida, and I said, "Look, I got a great opportunity for you. Your house is going to be underwater in the next 10 to 15 years. We know this because of the science. I will give you a 25% offer on the current value of your house right now, no questions asked." I think I could do that for literally every resident with beachfront property here in Florida and not get a single person, no matter what their politics are, who they vote for, or how much they say they're worried about climate and climate change is going to melt the world. Not a single one of them would take me up on that because they don't actually believe it. This is the thing with climate change. They just want the benefit of the pretense of the belief without actually having to live the lifestyle or go through any of this. It's always somebody else who has to bear the cost of the action necessary to keep all of this going, right? Somebody else has to make the sacrifices.
I love looking for the whole Davos thing where you fly on a private jet, often get picked up by a helicopter once you land your private jet to go talk about how threatening climate change is absurdly hypocritically ridiculous. But your point on Miami is a good one. I would just go out to L.A. Every single day, it feels like, certainly every month, there is a massive new record sell in Malibu. On the beach, beachfront properties going for dollar figures that are through the roof. Yet, when I put on the Oscars, to the extent that I do, because I'm not sure I saw any of the movies that are going to be Oscar nominated this year, a decent number of those actors and actresses that get up and speak about how dangerous the climate is in the world will either have the people who fund their movies having bought Malibu beach houses or own one themselves. If you truly believe, I'll be honest with you, one of the first things I did when I sold my company, Buck, was buy beachfront property down on the Florida Gulf Coast to build a home down there. I don't believe that home is ever going to be in danger because of the rising oceans. Neither do the people buying homes in Malibu, because if you did, one of them sold for $100 million recently, Buck. It's on the beach.
And you could even say, well, okay, well, fine. Maybe they just want the house for the next 10 years and they'll roll the dice on the rest of it. Okay, I'll buy land. Sell me undeveloped beachfront land in Malibu because, that'll take a long time. I'll have to build a house. I'll have to do I'll take that 30-year bet right now. I'll take that 30-year bet. Not a single person will actually do it. Nobody is willing to individually pay the price of their pseudo convictions when it comes to climate change. And the fact that people worship this child, Greta Thunberg, I guess she's like 18 now, right? But it's basically still a kid, doesn't know anything, and think that they treat her as some kind of symbol of wisdom on this. The same people who say, shut up and listen to Fauci and all the doctors because they're experts, the same people tell you, shut up and listen to Greta Thunberg. She understands the climate. Greta Thunberg couldn't do my Algebra 1 homework from high school, but I'm going to listen to her about the global economy and how we're all going to die unless we listen to her. Like this, there is a mass hysteria that has spread on issues like this, and particularly on climate change. I've talked to people I've had people approach me and say, you seem pretty reasonable and everything else. Some wealthy people in New York, this has happened before. They say, but I mean, you don't believe in climate change? They look at me like I'm crazy. And they think that that's some kind of marker of intelligence. Oh, believing in climate change means you're a smart person? Based on what?
Buck, every story that has to do with weather in the last decade, every one of them now must mention climate change in its article about weather. In the 1980s, it was cold and sometimes hot. They never said,
I do love late at night
if
I'm going to watch something. I love to watch, any of those old, the nature programs like, and like the sea lion is going through the ocean and, oh no, the pod of orcas has arrived. The whole thing, Richard Attenborough. Every time now you watch any nature programming, they'll be like, oh, this fish species is declining because of the ravages of climate change. Every single time. You can't watch one without that happening. And so I'm angry at them about that too, because they're ruining what should be. I mean, can't we just watch like lions chase gazelles without getting someone's lunatic politics thrown into the mix?
I will just point this out too. In addition to every time there is an article now about any climate issue, they mention, and you just said on the health, on the nature shows, they've been my wife used to make fun of this because I'll sometimes listen to history books on like audiobook when we're driving around, and she just rolls her eyes. The amount of time they spend talking about the weather in any history book, it's like, oh, we had a horrible storm and then that impacted. Like, weather's kind of been a big deal for a long time. And so this idea that every single time there is a unique weather event that is worthy of being covered as a story, that you have to discuss the climate change, yet simultaneously, what will they say, Buck, about any time a 20-year-old drops dead all of a sudden, you can't mention that there might be anything other than normal everyday life that this is involved in, right? Can't mention the COVID shot, but every single time there's a weather incident, you have to mention the climate.